Hello and welcome to another edition of Around the Coin. We are now in our fourth year and happy to make new episodes for our 22,000 plus listeners. A few quick announcements. If you would like to recommend someone to be interviewed, you can go to our website at aroundthecoin.com and fill out a form. Also, if you want to give some feedback, suggestions, or ask a question, same thing. Please go to our website, fill out the contact form, and we will be sure to take a look at your submissions. We will be at the Money 2020 Europe that is happening in Amsterdam from the 3rd of June to the 5th of June. If you're around, come and say hello. We'd love to meet up. Okay, and let's start our show. Continuing with our AML CFT compliance series. I'm your host, Faisal Khan.
My name is Dr. Mara Wesseling.
Doctor, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Doing good. So we've been doing this series of shows that we just started on compliance, AML, CFT, and everything else, all the three-letter acronyms that you can think of. This is our second show. It is going to be on FATF. FATF stands for Financial Action Task Force. It is an organization based in Paris, in France. And, the title of today's show is Creating Gold Standards and Paper Realities. So, Doctor, why don't you tell us what FATF is and why do I need to know about it?
Yes, I will. But first of all, I wanted to share maybe that we had some feedback after the first show, and we are very grateful for the feedback, and we have some acronym lovers as well. So they will be served again with the FATF show today. Maybe can I ask you, what do you think of when you think of FATF?
So, FATF is something I had no idea about. I heard the term first time maybe about 5 years ago, the Financial Action Task Force in Paris or something. I had no idea it was there for almost about 30 years now. And what its mission was, just had no clue. I was very oblivious about it. Being in the payment space, I was very oblivious about it. But it was only in the last maybe, I guess, 2 or 3 years that FATF has shown up on my radar and perhaps on the radar of everyone else. And it seems like there is this organization that, is basically setting the guidelines worldwide on the best practices of what AML, CFT, PF, etc. should be like. And all the member countries have to adhere to these guidelines. And if you do, you get to play in the World Financial Stadium. If you don't, you are, excluded from it. So that is what I know about FATF. What I feel about it is, I don't know. I have very mixed emotions about it, but I guess they stem from the fact that I don't know much about this organization. I have tried to learn up and read up and even seen some of their very long, YouTube sessions that they have put up, etc. And I'm still learning, but the feelings are mixed because I feel it is more or less like a bullying club, if I may, and I say that in the sense that I am very oblivious to what their mission is. I am trying to learn as much as I can. So yes, that sounds like a very reckless statement, and perhaps it is, but I feel that there's a lot of bullying in this club. It's the big boys, telling the developed countries how they can work and how they should work, or they will be excommunicated from the world's financial stage.
Well, I think you give a great summary of what FATF is, what it does. And I think the bullying part is not a completely wrong impression. Maybe, first of all, you said I was oblivious that it exists. And I think that's the case for many people. Even when we think of international organizations, people that study international organizations, they very often don't know about FATF. Then you said people in the payments industry, they don't necessarily know about FATF. So we have people that cringe upon hearing the acronym FATF. We have specialists that just don't care really about FATF. And we have still quite a few people that never heard about FATF. So this is the case for compliance officers, for regulated entities, but also, for instance, national supervisors. I've been talking to some of those, and they are not very, they know about FATF, of course, but they say we are supervising and we are checking against the national legal framework, so they're not that concerned. And then, on the other hand, you have people, well, researchers like myself, that look at international questions, and then FATF pops up all the time, and you get more and more intrigued because it's an international organization, but it's really a standard setting organization. The recommendations are officially non-binding. There's no legal tool if countries don't comply, but the punishment of non-compliance is so big that almost no country want to risk non-compliance. So in that case, you refer to bullying. I think, yeah, well, it's a club, and they decided on rules, international rules for the integrity of the international financial system. And if you don't adhere to them, it's a very costly decision.
So maybe you want to start off with by telling how this organization came into being. What was the genesis moment that made it so?
The genesis moment, and we talked a little bit about it the last show, was in the late 80s in the context of the fight against drug money laundering. So in 1989, the FATF was established, and it flew from a G7 initiative, but it quickly became broader and broader. And now 30 years later, we have, I think it's 36 member countries. We have member organizations. We have quite a big organization that is established and has associate members as well. So it's basically functioning worldwide, also through FATF-style regional bodies. So the 80s was really the starting point, and over time, more and more members joined, and also more and more missions were integrated to what FATF does. So from money laundering, it expanded into a broader fight against crime, organized crime, and then in the early 2000s, after 9/11, terrorism financing was included, and later on in 2012, the fight against proliferation was also included. So that's a very short history.
So why do I need to know about it? Why is it that, suddenly FATF is so important in our lives? It seems it has reached critical mass in many ways. So why do I need to know about it? Maybe you can shed some light on that.
Well, from a country perspective, what we just said, it's very costly to be non-compliant. You will be blacklisted if you really decide that you don't care about FATF recommendations, and it will lead to exclusion from the formal financial system. So 2 countries are currently blacklisted, North Korea and Iran. And it's a very costly choice because you cannot participate in the global economy. So yes, for non-compliance is very costly, and most countries make a lot of effort not to be on the non-cooperative territories and countries list. Then from a company perspective or from an individual perspective, for compliance officers dealing with AML on a daily basis, it's important, even if it seems like a faraway thing, it's important to know about what FATF does, because it will translate into national law, and it's the place where international policy is made. And if you want to understand what is going on in your field, what direction policy will go, or also if you want to find resources or information that might be relevant to your sector or your job, it's useful to look at what FATF does, and its publications are quite useful as well.
Okay, so let's come to the second part. Is FATF relevant for fintech or regtech? Because right now all the companies that are in the fintech space are obviously using financial, are offering some form of a financial services, whether that involves money or not. And same thing with regtech, and they're using technology. How important is FATF with respect to fintech and regtech?
Well, it will be increasingly important. FATF set up a so-called FinTech and RegTech initiative in 2016. Maybe that's also why you started hearing more and more about FATF 2-3 years ago. because it started this initiative to make sure that new financial innovations are in line with the AML CFT framework. And in this context, it's also organizing a private sector consultative forum, also the past 3 years. And it discusses topics that are relevant to fintech companies. And so for instance, customer identification or the use of digital ideas, how can fintech companies make sure that they put in practice the FATF recommendations of due diligence while doing what they do. So it will be increasingly important. And there are several initiatives going on also specifically regarding crypto. There has been a recent publication on that, I think last month. So I think the relevance is growing.
Well, regarding crypto, as I told you, I think, the United States currently chairs the FATF presidency, and the U.S. has made it a point that before they leave that chair, which expires in about maybe 2 months or so, that the crypto regulations will be out for the crypto guidelines for all member countries and the countries that are part of the financial system. So they will have to follow it. So whether we like it or not, crypto will now come under the umbrella of FATF, and which basically means worldwide, this is going to be regulated. But there's another important thing that I was at the sidelines of many conferences where the concept, the whole argument about de-risking and access to banking is talked about. And when we brought up, or when the topic of FATF came in, those on the developing countries felt that they were not being treated with the same respect or stature, that the FATF guidelines essentially come in and sort of, how do you say it, messing with the internal of banking affairs of each country and telling them how to run their own financial systems. And not just run the financial systems, what sort of incentives or innovative products they can and cannot have within the each economy. And if FATF doesn't like it, so, a country could be running a certain thing and the FATF says, well, you know what, this can be used for money laundering, we don't like it, and hence we are going to, grey list you or blacklist you. And they felt that was very unnecessary to do. What are your thoughts on something like this? Because you obviously have more insight to this than I have.
I don't know. We maybe have different insights. My view of it is that, the FATF is very powerful. It's very little known, but it is very powerful. And indeed, it makes recommendations on combating money laundering, terrorism financing, and so on. And you will have to adapt to it. So if your banking system does something that is not within the framework of FATF, you will have a problem. It goes actually even farther. If I can give another example, FATF it drafts recommendations, and FATF, it is the member states in the end. It's not some anonymous group of people. It's negotiators of member states that together draft recommendations. But it also evaluates how well countries are responding and implementing these. And part of that, so there is technical compliance which is, okay, is terrorism finance criminalized, or very technical matters that you can check with a tick the box approach. And then since 2012, there is a assessment of effectiveness as well, because there has been quite a lot of critique on FATF and the way FATF operates. It has been said, one scholar has said that FATF can be completely effective in establishing ineffective rules. So there has been quite some critique, and now they try to measure effectiveness in more in an evaluation assessment way. And one of the criteria is, are there enough prosecutions for money laundering and terrorism financing in each country? And if they decide they're not enough, then you get a bad score on this. So it's not only influencing the financial system and the shape of the banking system in a country, but even the judiciary. So it is really a powerful organization with a lot of impact.
So, what are some of the news coming out of FATF? I mean, we talk about FATF and terrorism declarations and UN resolutions, etc. Maybe shed some light on that.
Well, there is quite a range of news. We have had some evaluations recently. I think Norway was one of the countries that was assessed. We have some critique as well on what I just mentioned, the effectiveness approach. So on one hand, it is a step forward because for a long time, FATF was only looking at technical compliance and this tick the box approach. And so there is a step forward that it now really tries to see, okay, does it make sense? And is a country perhaps doing not so much on a specific issue because in this country, this issue is not a big problem, or really take into account the context? So I think some of the complaints that you just mentioned, countries complaining that they do things and that those are not recognized by FATF, I think it tries to respond to those complaints and to have, on one hand, it's a one-size-fits-all evaluation, and on the other hand, it tries to also take into account context that is not the same for every country. So there is progress, but there is still a lot of things that could be improved. For instance, the consistency between evaluations is not necessarily the same. We've had reporting as well in the Financial Times a few weeks ago, I think it was February, about political influence in the UK evaluation report. So it was said that some of the conclusions were a bit watered down to have a nicer view on how the UK is dealing with the FATF recommendations. So those were some of the latest things.
Yeah, I know that UAE had almost the same effect because United Arab Emirates was placed on the grey list and then, was chided for money laundering, and then suddenly after 2 weeks the name was taken off. So definitely some political influence over there, right?
Yes, yeah, no, definitely. And that's something, well, of course, we can imagine those things going on, but they should not be going on. And there as well, you can wonder, okay, which countries have enough power to negotiate the final results, and which countries maybe do not have that power. So the statement you made in the beginning about maybe different rules for different countries and some countries bullying others around, there is some truth into that.
I mean, it was very interesting to see that UAE was on the list and taken off, but Saudi Arabia still remains on the list, despite their political pressure and the connections that they have with Washington and so forth.
Yes, it is interesting.
So let me ask you some country evaluations. You talked about Norway and problematic aspects of it. What about what's happening recently in Estonia or Denmark? How will that play out when the further evaluations? I believe they have FATF-style regional bodies that will go and do evaluations every now and then. How will such large amounts of money laundering basically affect the country evaluations of these two countries I mentioned?
Well, that's a very good question. I actually don't know for sure the answer to that. What the evaluation team, so this is a process, it takes about 16 months to complete. So a country has to prepare, and even before
16 months for evaluation?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Wow.
So it's a really long process. And for instance, well, I can talk about the Netherlands. Will be going into the evaluation process in 2020, or maybe it has been postponed to 2021. But the government is already preparing for the assessment because it's so important. Countries do want to get good grades and a good evaluation result. So it's really important that they start ahead, and they try to have everything ready and as present themselves in the best way possible. And then we have the evaluation that takes 60 months. In total, we have it's a lot of paperwork. Countries have to show for each of the recommendations how they do it, give examples, but it even goes as far as the evaluating team, which is people from different member countries. They are assembled into an evaluation team, and they even contact other countries to check if this is true. If, for instance, if a country says we cooperate a lot with other countries, they will check with other countries if there is information exchange on money laundering cases or on combating terrorism financing cases. So there is a paper part, and there is an on-site part as well, and then there is some time as well for drafting the report. So altogether, it takes 16 months.
So let's say if something started, in January of 2019, and 16 months later, and in between, if new rules came, how are they affected? Are they grandfathered in, or what's the procedure? Because it seems if you are anything for 16 months that may come out of FATF would have to be put on pause until the next assessment, right?
Well, yes. The recommendations, they do change, but not that often. So there has been the last big reshuffling of rules was in 2012, which meant that before that there were recommendations against money laundering, 40 recommendations, and we had 9 special recommendations on terrorism financing. And in 2012, they reshuffled that and put them together in a new set of 40, but both topics together. So in the meantime, there are changes in interpretation or clarifications of specific recommendations, but it does not change all the time. But with this big change in 2012, also the new assessment strategy that also includes effectiveness evaluation was adopted. So yeah, then countries go into a new round, and it takes quite some time. It's quite a slow bureaucratic process.
So let's talk about that, the bureaucracy of it all. Others critique that we can have on on FATF, we can have paper realities. It can be perfectly effective in enforcing an ineffective framework and other arguments. I mean, what are your thoughts on something like on this? That is it a paper tiger?
It's not in the sense that there are real consequences if you
or
don't
maybe is it not a
comply.
paper tiger any longer?
I think there is improvement in not only looking at, okay, is there a law, but also is the law really implemented, and do we have examples? So there is more effectiveness. I think this change in methodology really did improve how FATF operates, but it gave rise to new problems. So one issue is there are 2 issues. Well, there is this issue of effectiveness, and you can wonder, okay, how representative is the indicator that is used to measure effectiveness? For instance, some countries like Sweden, many countries, they can have an innovative policy, and you wonder, is this also taken into account by FATF, or is the framework or the assessment method too rigid to really be open enough to take into account different approaches? So this is one thing. And then the other issue was bureaucracy and things going very slow. And my view of that is that you wonder, is the method to establish what is a threat, is the agility to respond to new threats, is it quick enough? Is it flexible enough? Or are we still, there was that's another news that came out. I think it was the 8th of April. So a statement made by the president of FATF at the United Nations, and it says that terrorism financing is one of the priorities of FATF, and this is also a big change, but it's maybe a different story. But focusing on groups such as ISIL and Al Qaeda, which of course are important terrorist threats. But you would say after New Zealand and many other occasions that the right-wing threat is also rising, and it did not really come back in the statements of FATF. So you wonder, are they quick enough to really integrate new typologies and new threats?
Very interesting. The member states, there's always a argument you hear that the member states, which are, let's say, I don't know, the G10 countries or what have you, the G7 countries, are out to essentially shut down the correspondent banking and offshore banking for all the tax havens that, the Caribbean and many other island nations have. And what they have is now the FATF tool that, going forward, let's say the next 10 years or the next 15 years, they will be able to implement policies that will essentially strip these island nations of the commoditized, offshore banking and the tax haven status that they used to have. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very interesting topic, I think. You recommended me to watch this YouTube movie on the Second Empire, which is a fascinating movie, and I think it summarizes.
So that for the listeners, it's called The Spider's Web. It's a YouTube documentary made with $4,000. It is worth watching, and it basically gives you an understanding on the city of London and how the offshore banking came into being in the Caribbean and how it started.
Yes, exactly. And I think one of the key arguments made in this movie was that there is this contradiction between politicians advocating and highlighting the importance of international regulations and measures like promoted by FATF and the AML international standards on AML CFT, on the international standards on tax evasion and the fight against that, and at the same time a reluctance to really make an end to these practices. So I think that's one of the main arguments in the movie, and I guess it is a truth that we have to deal with.
So thinking about what FATF is doing, it's obviously all the governments of all these member countries, working in together to make these rules and implement them. And I suppose that these rules are taken back to their home countries via their central banks and then enforced down. How much does FATF have to say with respect to the laws that need to be changed in many countries? Because, it's one thing making rule guidelines and then saying, they're not binding, but we all know that, essentially they will be binding if we want to stay into the financial system. How long or how much work is required by countries to change their banking laws or other laws in order to, fall in compliance with these guidelines?
Well, I would say quite substantial. If a country is evaluated by a FATF evaluation team, they really go into the nitty-gritty aspects of the law and the definition of the words in the law, and the organization is really, 16 months, it's a long time, but it's also because they really go into detail and they want proof. They want evidence of how things are done. They want to exactly understand what the law says, what the requirements are, how things are organized. They go quite far as well in their review and their recommendations. For instance, I believe it was Belgium. They thought the IT system of the Belgian Financial Intelligence Unit was not modern enough, so they make a recommendation that this should be updated. For some countries, they consider that there is not enough staff working on AML related topics. So it's really quite detailed, and a lot of effort is needed. Well, depending on the where you start from, but I would say that it requires quite a lot of effort for countries to mediate any things that are not in line with what FATF would like to see.
So, last question for you, and that comes from the education part of you or the career part of you. So, if you're in the compliance industry, etc., how does one get involved with understanding FATF, or how would FATF come into my radar if I were in the compliance arena? What do I need to do to study the guidelines, to get more knowledge about it, to be more involved, maybe even participate? How does that work out? Maybe some pointers you can give.
Yes, yeah, sure. Well, there is a lot on the FATF website. All the recommendations are there. The country evaluations are online as well. The best practices and lessons learned. We can find really a lot of things on FATF. Then, if you want to have a more critical view of it, there is not a lot, but there are some academic articles as well. There is this article, and we can maybe put it on the Around the Coin website, a link to some of the articles that are more critical of FATF. I myself did also write a report with a chapter on FATF, what it does, but also what is still a fundamental problem or methodological problem with FATF. So there's a lot online, and I think that's maybe the best way to start reading up about FATF.
Anything else you want to highlight? We did touch briefly on reports of political influence, but I think we will not go too much into that. But, it is an organization that I think is here to stay and will very much be part of our lives in the banking and payment system, whether we like it or not. But any concluding remarks from you, Dr. Mara?
It's definitely going to stay, I would say. There is no sign of it declining. It is, the evidence of the past 30 years is that there are more and more members, less and less countries blacklisted or grey listed. We haven't talked about the grey list. And it is taking charge of more and more topics as well. So I believe we will have to deal with it. And for some part is really, I would say, a positive thing. The aim of the organization is to have a level playing field, to enhance the integrity of the financial sector, to make sure, that criminal practices are limited, though it's a very difficult task to do. We will have to deal with it, and we will still have plenty of critique and things that we will not like about it as well for the coming years, I guess.
Well, Dr. Mara, thank you for that illuminating session. Next week, we will be talking about theaters of compliance, understanding the actors of the compliance industry. That will be hopefully next week. If you have any feedback or suggestions, or maybe you think that we should look at someone who should be interviewed, you can always go to our website, www.aroundthecoin.com. At the very top, there is a contact or a link. You can fill out a form, and we'd be happy to address the thing. Dr. Mara, thank you very much for your time. Till next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the hosts, co-hosts, and guests appearing on the show, and do not necessarily reflect the view of the owners and producers of the show. Paid advertisements in form of audio announcements may appear throughout the show, including this one. Advertising can also include print and other digital formats. The owners and producers of Around the Coin do not endorse or evaluate the advertised product, service, or company, nor any of the claims made by the advertisement. All programs are subject to a one-time charge for professional editing fees, for which the interviewing guest or guests may have contributed towards. The owners, producers, hosts, co-hosts, and guests on the show are not financial advisors. Any investment advice or opinions cited during the show is for information purposes only. None of the content is intended to be investment advice. Seek a duly licensed professional for investment advice. If you believe there's been any violation of your copyright, trademark, service mark, or any other type of intellectual property, please inform us in writing by sending an email to legal@aroundthecoin.com.